No one ever kissed me, whispered the trembling girl with skin like rich mahogany, as cruel laughter echoed through the dusty general store. The townsfolk saw her as nothing more than a charity case, a seamstress destined to live in shadows, forgotten and alone. Then the weathered cowboy with steel-gray eyes stepped through the doorway, his spurs jangling against wooden floors. Without hesitation, he removed his hat and bent down, pressing his lips gently to her forehead as the room fell silent. But this simple act of human kindness would unravel secrets buried deep in the town's foundation, secrets that could destroy them both or grant the girl power beyond anyone's imagination. Will their defiance of society's cruel boundaries lead to redemption? Or will the hidden forces determined to keep the truth buried crush them before justice can prevail? Before we continue, comment where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will publish a story there. The needle slipped through Risabel's finger as laughter erupted from the front of Henderson's general store. She pressed the wound to her lips and listened to the men's voices carry through the thin wooden walls. That girl thinks someone might actually court her. The voice belonged to Tom Bradley, the banker's son. Someone like her belongs in the fields, not pretending to be a seamstress. More laughter followed. Risa set down the torn work shirt she'd been mending and walked to the doorway separating the back room from the main store. Mrs. Henderson stood behind the counter, her face flushed with embarrassment, but saying nothing to stop the cruel talk. 3 men clustered near the penny candy jars. Tom Bradley stood in the center, his clean clothes and soft hands marking him as someone who'd never worked a day outdoors. The other 2 nodded along with his every word. No man in his right mind would waste time on that one, Bradley continued. She's lucky Mrs. Henderson keeps her around for charity work. Risa stepped into the doorway. The men noticed her immediately. Their laughter died, but their smirks remained. Well, speak of the devil, Bradley said. Tell us, girl, any suitors coming to call? The question hung in the air like smoke. Risa felt every eye in the store watching her. Mrs. Henderson busied herself with inventory sheets, refusing to meet her gaze. No one ever kissed me, Risa said quietly. The admission brought fresh laughter from the men. Bradley slapped his knee and turned to his companions. You hear that? 19 years old and never been kissed. What did I tell you? The door chimes rang as someone entered. Heavy boots crossed the wooden floor with purpose. The laughter stopped abruptly. Rust Carter stood in the doorway, dust from the trail still coating his dark coat. His steel-gray eyes took in the scene with the practiced assessment of a man who'd survived too many dangerous situations. The silence stretched until Bradley cleared his throat. Just having a friendly conversation, Bradley said, his voice losing some of its earlier confidence. Rust said nothing. He walked directly to where Risa stood and removed his worn hat. Without hesitation, he bent down and pressed his lips gently to her forehead. The kiss lasted only a moment, but it felt like the entire world had stopped turning. There, Rust said, straightening up. Now someone has. The color drained from Bradley's face. Mrs. Henderson dropped her pencil. The 2 other men backed toward the door as if the store had suddenly caught fire. You can't just, Bradley stammered. This isn't how things are done here. Rust's gaze never wavered from Bradley's face. Things change. Bradley and his companions hurried out of the store, the door chimes jangling violently behind them. Mrs. Henderson immediately began rearranging items on the counter that didn't need rearranging. Miss Bell, Rust said, replacing his hat. I'm sorry you had to endure their ignorance. Risa touched the spot on her forehead where his lips had been. Something had shifted inside her, like a door opening after years of being locked. Thank you, Mr. Carter. Just Rust. Mrs. Henderson finally spoke up. Mr. Carter, I appreciate your kindness, but this is a respectable establishment. We can't have scenes like this disrupting business. Of course, Rust said. My apologies for the disruption. He tipped his hat to both women and left the store. Risa watched him through the window as he mounted his horse and rode toward the boarding house at the end of town. Risa, Mrs. Henderson said, her voice tight, we need to talk. They moved to the back room where Risa spent most of her days. Mrs. Henderson closed the door and turned to face her with arms crossed. "That man just made trouble for both of us," she said. "People in this town have expectations. They have ways of doing things." He was being kind. Kindness doesn't pay the bills or keep this store running. Mrs. Henderson picked up the shirt Risa had been mending. "You need to understand something. I've given you work when no one else would. I've provided you with a place to sleep upstairs. But I can't protect you if you start causing problems." Risa felt the familiar weight of being unwanted pressing down on her shoulders. She'd carried that weight since childhood, moving from one reluctant caretaker to another after her parents died. "I understand," she said. "Do you?" Mrs. Henderson's expression softened slightly. "Tom Bradley's father owns half the businesses on this street. Sheriff Navarro won't take kindly to outsiders stirring up trouble. You need to keep your head down and stay out of sight." That evening, Risa climbed the narrow stairs to her small room above the store. She lit a single candle and sat on her bed, staring out the window at the town below. Most of the buildings were dark except for the saloon and the sheriff's office. She touched her forehead again, remembering the gentle pressure of Rust's lips. No one had ever defended her before. No one had ever treated her with such simple dignity. But Mrs. Henderson was right about one thing. This town had rules, and people who broke them faced consequences. Risa had learned long ago to make herself invisible, to avoid drawing attention that might bring trouble. Now a stranger had made her visible in the most public way possible. The thought both terrified and thrilled her. She pulled out a small wooden box from under her bed and opened it carefully. Inside lay the few possessions that connected her to her past. A locket that had belonged to her mother, a worn Bible with her family name written inside the cover, and a letter she'd found years ago, written in her father's hand but never delivered. Risa had always wondered about her parents' story. They'd died when she was too young to remember much about them, but sometimes she caught fragments of conversations that stopped abruptly when people noticed her listening, whispered comments about her father being someone important, about money that should have been set aside for her care. She'd learned not to ask questions. Questions brought trouble, and trouble brought attention she couldn't afford. But now, holding the letter in the candlelight, she wondered if staying invisible was really the safest choice. Rust Carter had shown her what it looked like when someone refused to accept the way things were. Maybe it was time to stop hiding. 3 days passed before Risa saw Rust again. Mrs. Henderson had kept her busy with inventory and cleaning tasks that seemed designed to keep her away from the front of the store. The message was clear without being spoken. Word of the kiss had spread through Copper Ridge like wildfire. Customers whispered when they thought she couldn't hear. Some shook their heads in disapproval. Others seemed genuinely curious about the strange cowboy who dared to treat her with respect. Sheriff Navarro visited the store on Thursday morning. He was a large man with cold eyes and a badge that he wore like a weapon. He spoke quietly with Mrs. Henderson near the fabric display, while Risa sorted buttons in the back room. "That drifter needs to understand how things work here," Navarro said. "We can't have outsiders disrupting the peace." "I've spoken to the girl," Mrs. Henderson replied. "She knows to keep her distance." "Good. Make sure she remembers." Risa's hands trembled as she continued sorting. She'd heard stories about Sheriff Navarro's methods of keeping the peace. Men who crossed him had a way of finding themselves in jail on trumped-up charges, or run out of town in the middle of the night. The sheriff left without acknowledging her presence. Mrs. Henderson returned to the back room with a troubled expression. "You heard?" she asked. Risa nodded. "Then you understand the situation. That man Carter, he's putting us both at risk." But Mrs. Henderson was wrong about Rust staying away. That afternoon, he appeared at the store's back door while she swept the alley. He moved quietly for such a large man. "Miss Bell." She looked up, startled. "You shouldn't be here." "Probably not." He leaned against the doorframe. "But I wanted to make sure you were all right." "I'm fine." "Are you?" The simple question caught her off guard. When was the last time anyone had actually cared about her well-being? She set down the broom and really looked at him. His clothes were worn but clean. His hands showed calluses from hard work, but his eyes held a kindness she wasn't used to seeing. "The sheriff came by," she said. Rust's expression hardened. What did he want? To remind everyone how things work in this town. And how do they work? Risa hesitated. The honest answer felt dangerous to speak aloud. People like me stay quiet. People like you move on. What if I don't want to move on? The question hung between them. Risa felt something stirring in her chest, a feeling she couldn't quite name. Hope, maybe, or courage. "Mrs. Henderson needs the store swept," she said, picking up the broom again. Rust nodded, but didn't leave immediately. "Miss Bell?" "Yes?" "My given name is Russell. My friends call me Rust. I don't think we can be friends, Mr. Carter. Maybe not yet." He walked away, leaving Rissa alone with her thoughts and a growing sense that her carefully ordered world was about to change whether she wanted it to or not. That evening, she decided to clean the store's basement storage room. Mrs. Henderson rarely went down there, complaining that the stairs hurt her knees. It was dusty work, but it gave Risa time to think without interruption. She was moving boxes of old inventory when she noticed something odd. One section of the wall looked different from the rest. The boards were newer, and they didn't quite line up properly. Risa ran her fingers along the edges until she found a loose board. It moved slightly when she pressed against it. She worked carefully until the board came free, revealing a hidden space behind the wall. Inside was a metal box, tarnished with age but still solid. Her heart pounded as she lifted it out and set it on the floor. The lid opened with a rusty creak. The box contained papers. Lots of papers. Letters tied with faded ribbon. Legal documents with official seals. And at the bottom, a leather journal with her father's name embossed on the cover. Risa opened the journal with trembling hands. The first page was dated 20 years earlier, written in her father's careful script. "Today, I signed the papers establishing Copper Ridge. The land office has recorded me as the primary founder and largest landowner. I pray this town will become a place where people can build better lives, regardless of where they come from or what they look like." She turned the page, her eyes racing over the words. "I've met someone. Her name is Sarah, and she has the most beautiful smile I've ever seen. It doesn't matter to me that others might disapprove. Love sees past the boundaries that fear creates. Sarah." Her mother's name was Sarah. Rissa continued reading, the journal entries telling a story she'd never heard. Her father, Samuel Ridge, had been the town's founder. He'd owned vast amounts of land, including most of what was now the main business district. He'd fallen in love with her mother despite social pressure to marry someone deemed more suitable. The later entries grew more troubled. Samuel wrote about pressure from other prominent families to end his relationship with Sarah. He mentioned setting up legal protections to ensure his future children would be provided for, no matter what happened to him. The last entry was dated just months before Risa was born. "I've hidden the legal documents where they'll be safe. If something happens to me, Sarah will know where to find them. Our child will inherit what is rightfully theirs. The land, the businesses, the money I've set aside. No one can take that away. Not even the families who think they run this town." Risa set down the journal with shaking hands. She looked through the legal documents, trying to understand their meaning. Property deeds, bank account information, a will that named her as Samuel Ridge's heir. If these documents were authentic, she owned a significant portion of Copper Ridge, the land under Henderson's general store, the lot where the bank stood, several residential properties throughout town. She'd been living as a charity case in a building that she actually owned. The implications hit her like a physical blow. All these years of being treated as less than nothing, of accepting scraps and gratitude for basic shelter, of enduring cruel comments about her place in the world. She was the rightful heir to the town founder's estate. But why hadn't her mother told her? Why had this information been hidden away like a shameful secret? Risa gathered the papers carefully and returned them to the metal box. She couldn't process this alone. She needed time to think, to plan, to figure out what this discovery meant for her future. One thing was certain. She was done being invisible. As she climbed the stairs back to the main store, she thought about Rust's words. What if I don't want to move on? Maybe it was time to stop accepting the way things were. Maybe it was time to fight for the way things should be. But first, she needed to understand exactly what she was fighting for. Risa spent the weekend studying every document in the hidden box. She read each paper multiple times, cross-referencing names and dates until she understood the full scope of her inheritance. Her father had been more than just the town founder. He'd been its primary investor and largest landowner. The property deeds alone were staggering. Samuel Ridge had owned the land under 12 businesses on Main Street, including the general store where she now worked as hired help. He'd also established a trust fund at the Copper Ridge Bank, designated specifically for his future children's education and welfare. By Monday morning, Risa had made her decision. She would reveal her identity, but she needed an ally, someone who understood how to navigate conflict and wasn't afraid to stand against the established order. She found Rust at the boarding house, sitting on the front porch and reading a week-old newspaper. He looked up as she approached, surprise flickering across his face. "Miss Bell, everything all right? I need to show you something." They walked to the edge of town where they could speak privately. Risa pulled the most important documents from her satchel and handed them to Rust. His expression grew more serious as he read. "Your father was Samuel Ridge," he said finally, "the town founder, and according to these papers, I'm his legal heir." Rust studied the property deeds more carefully. These look authentic. The seals, the signatures, the legal language. If this is legitimate, you own half of Main Street. I've been living as charity in a building I actually own. The anger in her voice surprised them both. Risa had spent so many years accepting her circumstances that she'd almost forgotten what righteous indignation felt like. "Why reveal this now?" Rust asked. "Because I'm tired of being invisible. Because you showed me what it looks like when someone refuses to accept the way things are." Rust folded the documents carefully. "This won't be easy. People in power don't give it up willingly. I know, but I have the law on my side. The law is only as strong as the people willing to enforce it." They walked back toward town in comfortable silence. Risa felt lighter somehow, as if sharing her secret had lifted a weight she'd carried for years. But she also felt nervous. Once she made her identity public, there would be no going back to her quiet life of invisibility. The opportunity came sooner than expected. Tuesday afternoon, the town council called an emergency meeting. Word spread quickly through the streets. Sheriff Navarro had convinced the council that Rust represented a threat to public order and needed to be removed from Copper Ridge immediately. The meeting was held in the town hall, a small building adjacent to the sheriff's office. By 5 o'clock, nearly every adult in town had crowded inside. Risa stood in the back, her satchel containing the legal documents pressed against her chest. Council Chairman Porter called the meeting to order. He was a thin man with nervous eyes who clearly preferred dealing with mundane town business rather than controversial situations. "We're here to address concerns about recent disturbances to the peace," Porter announced. "Sheriff Navarro will present his assessment of the situation." Navarro stood up, his imposing figure commanding immediate attention. "Gentlemen, we have a problem. An outsider has come to our town and begun disrupting our established way of life. This man, Russell Carter, has shown blatant disrespect for our customs and values." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some nodded in agreement. Others looked uncomfortable with the sheriff's characterization. "Therefore," Navarro continued, "I recommend that Mr. Carter be given 24 hours to leave Copper Ridge voluntarily. If he refuses, he'll be escorted out by force." "That's quite serious," Porter said. "Mr. Carter, would you like to respond to these allegations?" Rust stood up slowly. Even in the crowded room, his presence seemed to fill the available space. "Sheriff Navarro seems to believe that treating another human being with basic respect constitutes a disturbance of the peace." "I disagree. You don't understand how things work here," Navarro shot back. "We have an order to maintain." "Whose order?" The simple question hung in the air. Navarro's face reddened, but before he could respond, Risa stepped forward. I have something to say. The crowd turned to look at her. Many seemed surprised that she would speak at all. Mrs. Henderson, sitting near the front, looked mortified. Miss Bell, Porter said uncertainly. This is a council meeting. We don't usually hear from property owners? Risa interrupted. The room fell silent. Even Sheriff Navarro looked puzzled by her words. Risa walked to the front of the room, her heart pounding but her voice steady. My name is Clarissa Bell Ridge. I am the daughter of Samuel Ridge, founder of this town. Gasps erupted throughout the hall. Porter dropped his gavel. Tom Bradley, sitting with his father near the front, turned pale. That's impossible, Navarro said. Samuel Ridge never had children. He did. Risa pulled the birth certificate from her satchel. Born to Samuel Ridge and Sarah Bell on March 15, 1855, registered at the territorial capital and signed by Judge Morrison. She handed the document to Porter, who examined it with shaking hands. The official seals and signatures were clearly visible. Furthermore, Risa continued, her confidence growing with each word, I am the legal heir to my father's estate, including the land under this very building. She distributed copies of the property deeds throughout the room. People leaned forward to examine the documents, whispering among themselves as they recognized the legal language and official markings. According to territorial law, Risa said, her voice carrying to every corner of the room, Mr. Carter has committed no crime. He cannot be forced to leave property owned by someone who has given him permission to stay. The education she'd received from Pastor Williams's wife had included extensive reading in legal texts. Risa had memorized territorial statutes about property rights and due process. She'd never imagined she would need that knowledge to defend herself and a friend in a public forum. This is preposterous, Navarro sputtered. Even if these documents are real, that doesn't change anything. The girl is still the legal landowner, Rust interjected, standing beside Risa. With all the rights and privileges that entails. Porter examined the documents more carefully, consulting with other council members in hushed tones. Finally, he looked up at the expectant crowd. These appear to be authentic legal documents, he announced. If Miss Bell Ridge can prove her identity definitively, then her property claims would need to be recognized under territorial law. I demand a formal hearing, Risa said, with proper legal procedures and full examination of the evidence. The crowd erupted in conversation. Some people seemed excited by the unexpected drama. Others appeared disturbed by the challenge to established order. Sheriff Navarro looked like he wanted to arrest everyone in the room. Very well, Porter said, gaveling for quiet. We'll schedule a formal hearing for next Monday. All interested parties should prepare their evidence and arguments. As the meeting broke up, Risa felt both exhilarated and terrified. She'd stepped out of the shadows completely. There was no hiding anymore. Rust walked beside her as they left the building. That was impressive. That was just the beginning. The week between the town meeting and the formal hearing transformed Copper Ridge into a battlefield of whispered conversations and divided loyalties. Risa found herself at the center of a storm she'd never imagined possible. Mrs. Henderson fired her the morning after the meeting. The dismissal came without explanation, just a curt instruction to collect her belongings and vacate the room above the store. Risa packed her few possessions into a single carpet bag, including the precious metal box containing her father's documents. Alara May appeared at the store's back door as Risa prepared to leave. Heard you might need a place to stay, the saloon keeper said simply. Alara was a woman of perhaps 40 years with graying hair and eyes that missed nothing. She'd run the Copper Ridge Saloon for over a decade, serving drinks and meals to anyone with money to pay, regardless of their background or social standing. I can pay, Risa said, though her savings were meager. We'll figure something out. The saloon's upstairs rooms were simple but clean. Alara showed Risa to a corner room with a window overlooking Main Street. From there, she could watch the town's daily activities while remaining relatively unseen. Why are you helping me? Risa asked. Alara sat heavily in the room's single chair. Because I knew your father. And I remember what this town was supposed to be before fear took over. Over the next few days, Alara shared stories about Samuel Ridge that no one else had ever told Risa. Her father had envisioned Copper Ridge as a place where people could build new lives free from the prejudices of their past. He'd actively recruited settlers from diverse backgrounds, offering land and opportunities to families that other towns would have turned away. He was ahead of his time, Alara explained. Some folks supported his vision. Others resented it from the beginning. What happened to him? Accident at the mine. Cave-in that killed 3 men, including your father. Alara's expression darkened, though some people wondered if it was really an accident. The implication hung in the air like smoke. Risa felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening temperature. Meanwhile, Rust had been conducting his own investigation. His military experience had taught him how to gather intelligence methodically. He spent his days talking to longtime residents, asking casual questions about the town's early history and Samuel Ridge's death. What he discovered was troubling. Several elderly residents remembered Samuel Ridge fondly, but they spoke in hushed tones as if afraid of being overheard. They confirmed that Ridge had owned extensive property throughout the town and had established trust funds for future community development. But they also revealed something more sinister. After Ridge's death, certain prominent families had quickly moved to consolidate power. Property transfers had happened with unusual speed. The trust funds had been redirected for administrative purposes that seemed to benefit a select few. Most disturbing of all, Sheriff Navarro had arrived in Copper Ridge just months after Samuel Ridge died, despite having no apparent connections to the area. Rust shared his findings with Rissa on Friday evening. They met in Alara's private dining room after the saloon closed for the night. Your father's death created a power vacuum, Rust explained. Navarro and his allies filled it quickly. You think they killed him? I think they benefited tremendously from his death. Whether they caused it or just took advantage of it, the result was the same. Alara poured coffee for all 3 of them. There's something else you should know. The Copper Ridge Bank has been mismanaging estate funds for years. Money that should have gone to widows and orphans has disappeared into operating expenses and administrative fees. Risa felt anger building in her chest. My inheritance? Among others. If your father set up trust funds like you believe, Sheriff Navarro has probably been stealing from them. The pieces of a larger puzzle were falling into place. Risa's emergence as Samuel Ridge's heir threatened more than just social order. It threatened a criminal enterprise that had been operating for 20 years. Saturday morning brought unexpected visitors to the saloon. Tom Bradley and 2 other prominent businessmen requested a private meeting with Risa. Alara showed them to the dining room, where Risa waited with Rust beside her. Miss Bell, Bradley began, his tone more respectful than she'd ever heard from him. We've come to discuss a reasonable solution to this situation. What kind of solution? Bradley produced a folder of papers. We're prepared to offer you a substantial cash settlement. Enough money to leave Copper Ridge and start a new life anywhere you choose. Risa glanced at the papers without touching them. In exchange for? Your agreement not to pursue these inheritance claims. A clean break that benefits everyone involved. And if I refuse? Bradley's expression hardened slightly. Then you'll face a lengthy legal battle against people with considerable resources. Court cases can drag on for years, especially when the evidence is disputed. Are you disputing the evidence? We're suggesting that some documents can be difficult to authenticate. Signatures can be forged. Seals can be counterfeited. The threat was clear without being explicitly stated. They would challenge every piece of evidence she presented, regardless of its legitimacy. Rust leaned forward slightly. Gentlemen, I think you underestimate Miss Ridge's determination. And I think you overestimate your ability to protect her, Bradley replied coldly. After the men left, Risa sat quietly for several minutes. The weight of what she was up against was becoming clear. This wasn't just about proving her identity or claiming her inheritance. This was about exposing a network of corruption that extended throughout the town's power structure. They're scared, Rust observed. Good, Risa replied. They should be. But privately, She wondered if her courage would be enough to see this through. The forces arrayed against her had money, influence, and 20 years of practice at maintaining control. All she had was the truth and a handful of allies. Sunday evening, Ilara brought disturbing news. She'd overheard Sheriff Navarro meeting with several men at the far end of the saloon. They'd been discussing contingency plans for the Monday hearing. "They're not planning to let you win," Ilara warned. "Even if your evidence is perfect, they'll find ways to discredit it." Risa looked out her window at the town below. Lights flickered in windows where families were settling down for the evening. Most of these people had no idea that their community had been built on lies and theft. Tomorrow would determine whether justice could prevail or if power would continue to protect itself at any cost. She pulled out her father's journal and read his words one more time. "I pray this town will become a place where people can build better lives, regardless of where they come from or what they look like." Samuel Ridge's dream was still possible. But first, his daughter would have to fight for it. Monday morning arrived gray and cold. Risa woke before dawn and spent an hour organizing her evidence into careful stacks. Birth certificates, property deeds, her father's journal, and bank records filled her leather satchel. Each document represented a piece of the truth that had been hidden for 20 years. The town hall overflowed with spectators by 9 o'clock. Every chair was filled, and people stood along the walls and crowded near the doorway. Word had spread throughout the county, drawing curious observers from neighboring settlements. Judge Harrison had arrived from the territorial capital the previous evening. He was a stern man in his 60s with wire-rimmed spectacles and a reputation for fairness. His presence lent official weight to the proceedings. Council Chairman Porter called the hearing to order. "We're here to examine Miss Clarissa Bell's claim to be the legal heir of Samuel Ridge and to determine the validity of her property rights." Risa sat at a small table near the front of the room. Rust occupied the chair beside her, his presence both comforting and protective. Across the aisle, Tom Bradley represented the opposition, with Sheriff Navarro looming behind him. "Miss Bell," Judge Harrison said, "please present your evidence." Risa stood and walked to the center of the room. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice remained steady. "Your Honor, I submit these documents as proof of my identity and inheritance." She handed the judge her birth certificate first. The official document clearly listed Samuel Ridge as her father and Sarah Bell as her mother. The date, signatures, and territorial seals were all clearly visible. Judge Harrison examined the certificate carefully, holding it up to the light and scrutinizing every detail. "This appears to be authentic territorial documentation." Next came the property deeds. Risa had organized them chronologically, showing how Samuel Ridge had systematically acquired land throughout what became the town center. The legal descriptions matched current property boundaries with remarkable precision. These deeds established Samuel Ridge as the original owner of significant property in Copper Ridge, Judge Harrison noted, including the land under 12 commercial buildings and numerous residential lots. The most compelling evidence was Samuel Ridge's will. The document clearly identified Risa as his heir and established trust funds for her education and welfare. It had been properly witnessed and notarized according to territorial law. Judge Harrison spent considerable time reviewing the will. "This document appears to be legally binding. It specifically names Clarissa Bell Ridge as the primary beneficiary of Samuel Ridge's estate." Tom Bradley stood to present his counterarguments. "Your Honor, we don't dispute that these documents exist. However, we question their authenticity and relevance." "On what grounds?" Bradley produced his own folder of papers. "We have evidence that Samuel Ridge died without legitimate heirs. The woman he was involved with left town shortly after his death, and there's no record of any children being born from that relationship." "Yet here is a birth certificate stating otherwise," Judge Harrison replied. "Birth certificates can be forged. Seals can be counterfeited." "We're dealing with someone who clearly has motivation to fabricate evidence." Risa felt anger rising in her chest, but she forced herself to remain calm. She'd expected these attacks on her credibility. "Your Honor," she said, "I have additional evidence that supports these documents." She pulled out a small photograph from her father's belongings. It showed Samuel Ridge standing beside a young woman who bore a striking resemblance to Risa. On the back, someone had written Samuel and Sarah, 1854, in her father's distinctive handwriting. Judge Harrison compared the photograph to samples of Samuel Ridge's signature on various town documents. The handwriting appears consistent. But Risa wasn't finished. She'd spent the weekend preparing for every possible challenge to her evidence. From her satchel, she produced a letter written by Pastor Williams, the minister who had secretly educated her. Pastor Williams knew both my parents, she explained. This letter describes his memories of their relationship and confirms details about my birth that aren't public knowledge. The pastor's letter corroborated key elements of her story and provided independent verification of facts that would be impossible for an impostor to know. Judge Harrison read the letter carefully. This provides significant supporting evidence for Miss Bell's claims. But the most damaging evidence was yet to come. Rust had spent Sunday evening at the bank, using his military connections to access financial records. What he'd discovered would change everything. Your Honor, Risa said, I have one more document to present. Bank records showing systematic theft from my father's estate. She handed Judge Harrison a detailed accounting of the trust fund that Samuel Ridge had established for his future children. The records showed regular withdrawals over the past 20 years, all authorized by Sheriff Navarro as administrative expenses. The amounts were staggering. Thousands of dollars that should have been held in trust had been diverted to personal accounts and questionable expenditures. The financial trail led directly to several prominent families, including the Bradleys. Judge Harrison's expression grew increasingly stern as he reviewed the banking records. These documents suggest serious financial improprieties. Sheriff Navarro finally spoke up. Those records are confidential bank business. They have no bearing on this inheritance claim. On the contrary, Judge Harrison replied, if Miss Bell is indeed Samuel Ridge's heir, then these funds legally belong to her. The unauthorized withdrawal of trust funds constitutes theft. The room erupted in whispered conversations. People turned to stare at Sheriff Navarro with new understanding. The man who had enforced law and order for 2 decades was revealed as a criminal. Tom Bradley made one last desperate attempt to discredit the evidence. Your Honor, even if these documents are authentic, they don't change the social realities of this situation. This woman lacks the background and education to manage significant property holdings. Risa had been waiting for this moment. She stepped forward and began reciting territorial property law from memory, citing specific statutes and legal precedents with the precision of a trained attorney. Section 15 of the Territorial Property Act establishes that inheritance rights cannot be denied based on gender, race, or social standing, she said. Furthermore, the Property Management Statute of 1867 requires only that an heir demonstrate basic competency in legal and financial matters. She continued for several minutes, displaying a comprehensive understanding of complex legal principles that impressed even Judge Harrison. Miss Bell, the judge said finally, where did you acquire this legal education? From the same books that any educated person would study, Your Honor. The law belongs to everyone, not just those who can afford formal schooling. Judge Harrison nodded slowly. Indeed it does. The hearing continued for another hour. But the outcome was no longer in doubt. Bradley's challenges crumbled under the weight of documented evidence and Risa's demonstrated competency. When Judge Harrison finally rendered his decision, his words carried the full authority of territorial law. Based on the evidence presented, I find that Miss Clarissa Bell Ridge is the legitimate daughter and legal heir of Samuel Ridge. Her inheritance rights are hereby recognized and restored. The courtroom exploded in reactions ranging from cheers to angry protests. But through the chaos, Risa felt something she'd never experienced before. She felt like she truly belonged somewhere. The aftermath of the hearing changed everything in Copper Ridge, though not as quickly as Risa had hoped. Judge Harrison's ruling carried legal weight, but social transformation moved at its own stubborn pace. Sheriff Navarro was immediately removed from office and ordered to make full restitution to the Samuel Ridge estate. The stolen trust funds, accumulated with 20 years of interest, amounted to a substantial fortune. Federal marshals escorted him out of town 3 days after the hearing, but not before he'd attempted to destroy additional evidence of his crimes. Tom Bradley and several other prominent families faced their own legal challenges. The web of corruption extended deeper than anyone had imagined, involving fraudulent property transfers and misappropriated municipal funds. Some families chose to settle quietly rather than face public trials. Risa took possession of her inherited properties with a mixture of triumph and overwhelming responsibility. She now owned the land under 12 businesses, including Henderson's General Store, the Copper Ridge Bank, and the town hall itself. The financial accounts restored to her provided enough capital to modernize and expand the entire commercial district. Her first act as a property owner was to offer fair lease agreements to existing tenants. Mrs. Henderson, faced with the choice between accepting Risa as her landlord or losing her business entirely, chose pragmatic cooperation over stubborn pride. "The terms are generous," Mrs. Henderson admitted during their first official meeting. "More generous than I deserve." "Everyone deserves a chance to build something better," Risa replied. But not everyone embraced the changes. Several families left Copper Ridge rather than accept the new social order. Others remained but maintained their distance, clinging to old prejudices even as the power structure shifted around them. Risa understood that lasting change required more than legal victories. It required building bridges between communities that had been separated by fear and misunderstanding for decades. She began by reopening the town's school, which had been closed for lack of funding. The previous school had only served children from established families. Risa's school welcomed everyone, regardless of background or ability to pay tuition. Finding a teacher proved challenging until an unexpected volunteer emerged. Pastor Williams, the elderly minister who had secretly educated Risa years earlier, offered his services. His deep knowledge and patient teaching style made him perfect for the diverse student body. The school's opening day drew curious observers from throughout the county. Children of different backgrounds sat side by side in the same classroom, sharing books and learning together. Some parents remained skeptical, but they couldn't argue with the quality of education their children received. Rust played an increasingly important role in Risa's vision for Copper Ridge. His military experience proved invaluable for organizing community projects and managing the practical aspects of town improvement. He supervised the construction of new roads, the expansion of the water system, and the establishment of a proper medical clinic. Their partnership had evolved from friendship into something deeper, though neither spoke openly about their growing feelings. The town was still adjusting to dramatic changes, and they didn't want to add unnecessary controversy to an already volatile situation. Alara May became Risa's closest advisor and confidant. The saloon keeper understood the complex social dynamics of frontier communities better than anyone. She helped Risa navigate delicate negotiations with resistant families and identify opportunities for building cooperation. "Change is like breaking in a wild horse," Alara observed. "Push too hard, and it fights back. Be patient and steady, and eventually it learns to trust you." The strategy worked. Families that had initially opposed Risa began to appreciate the tangible improvements to their community. New businesses opened as word spread about Copper Ridge's economic opportunities. The town's population grew steadily as settlers arrived seeking the fair treatment and equal opportunities that Samuel Ridge had originally envisioned. Risa established a community council that included representatives from all backgrounds. Decision-making became a collaborative process, rather than the dictatorial system that had existed under Sheriff Navarro's influence. The council addressed issues ranging from business licenses to dispute resolution with fairness and transparency. The bank, now under Risa's ownership, began offering loans to entrepreneurs who had previously been denied access to capital. Small farms expanded into profitable operations. Craftsmen opened shops. Women started businesses that had never been possible under the old system. 1 year after the hearing, Copper Ridge hosted its first Founders' Day celebration. The festival honored Samuel Ridge's original vision while celebrating the community's progress toward that ideal. Families that had barely spoken to each other 12 months earlier now worked together, organizing events and activities. Risa stood on the town hall steps, looking out at the celebration. Children played games in the street while their parents shared food and conversation. Musicians performed on a temporary stage, their songs reflecting the diverse cultural heritage of the expanded community. Rust joined her on the steps, his presence as natural and comfortable as breathing. "Your father would be proud," he said quietly. "I think he'd be amazed that it actually worked." "What's next?" Risa pulled a letter from her dress pocket. It had arrived the previous week from a group of settlers in a neighboring territory. They'd heard about Copper Ridge's transformation and wanted advice on creating similar changes in their own community. "We're going to help other towns," she said. "The model works, but it needs to spread." Rust smiled. From one kiss to changing the world. It was a good kiss. It was the right kiss at the right moment. As evening fell, the celebration moved indoors to various venues throughout town. Risa and Rust walked down Main Street, greeting neighbors and friends. The simple act of walking together publicly would have been scandalous just 1 year earlier. Now it barely drew notice from a community that had learned to judge people by their character rather than their appearance. They paused outside the general store where their journey had begun. Through the window, they could see Mrs. Henderson training a new assistant, a young woman from one of the recently arrived immigrant families. "Do you ever regret it?" Rust asked. "All the conflict and struggle?" Risa thought about the question seriously. The past year had been filled with challenges she never could have imagined: legal battles, social resistance, financial complexity, and the constant pressure of living up to her father's legacy. But she also thought about the children in the integrated school, the families building new lives with dignity and opportunity, and the community that was slowly becoming what Samuel Ridge had dreamed it could be. "Never," she said finally. "Not for a single moment." They continued walking through their transformed town, partners in both love and justice, carrying forward a vision of what America could become when courage faced down fear and truth overcame prejudice.